Alright, so this should be the last of my between the seasons, whatever you want to call these. And fortunately, this is also the one I'm looking forward to, as this is where I would like to introduce what Season 2 is going to be about. Right, so Season 1 with Yakeem was really just to see how long I could keep a juicer alive, which wasn't terribly long, but long enough. And, having a finality to a character is difficult, but at the same time, especially for solo role-playing, if I'm not running a particular adventure, there has to be an end to the story at some point, right? And truthfully, as I stated before, I enjoy flawed characters. Whatever that says about me, that's between me and my therapist. But most importantly, I think it's important between, the game that I want to play and how I like seeing these characters kind of like spin, sometimes out of control, sometimes back into control, but always barreling towards something. Ultimately, when we're role-playing these kind of characters, they have, for us, a start, middle, and finish, right? But the characters usually start just before the action actually begins. The party meets in a bar, they meet in a tavern, they meet unconscious as a bunch of prisoners to the drow, whatever the plot line is, but the characters had a life before, and hopefully your characters will have a life after. But the in-between, where we as the viewers kind of zoom in, that's the interesting bit. That's kind of where the TV show begins, and eventually they're supposed to evolve and change and gain powers and abilities and control over themselves that we, in our own lives, sometimes feel like we may not always have. So to develop a character that can evolve and change, there has to be conflict, and that conflict has to come with threat. And so, to me, the threat needs to be that, at least from my point of view and my philosophy, the finality, right? There has to be something in which this person runs the gamut, walks along the razor's edge where they could eventually no longer be. For Yakeem, that was, or at least for a juicer, that was pretty obvious because they have such a short time span. But for other characters, a lot of the other frameworks in Savage Rifts, they don't have that easy to understand finality. The juicer in its all-inspiring power, that is the biggest attraction for it. That is the hindrance that drives the rest of the character forward. So I was looking around, trying to determine what other characters could have something kind of along those same lines. What characters have the real risk, not just of getting shot by a bandit or skewered by a vampire, but that they risk losing it all, just sometimes pushing themselves, where they could become either no longer under my control or just, Yakeem's portion that he had to choose to burn out. One of the classes that drew me in, because it's kind of the other side, but not too dissimilar to the juicers, is the Cyber Knight. So, Cyber Knights are, in Savage Rifts, they are the kind of like wandering Ronin, or they are the friendly cowboy, or, they are King Arthur's knights. They are these well-received, heroic figures that seem to be able to leap into the jaws of disaster and produce victory, right? They are well-respected. Even the Coalition states will sometimes, according to the lore, turn a blind eye to what a Cyber Knight is doing as long as they are helping humanity. Now, of course, Cyber Knights are not limited to just humans. And despite the fact that, the Coalition states is very, very, anti-non-human, even a dimensional being, Cyber Knight, will occasionally kind of get glanced over and ignored unless they do something that just really rubs somebody the wrong way. So, to me, that's kind of it's an interesting dichotomy, taking a creature, a particular person who is going to be treated poorly by the Coalition states, but put them into an honorable position where the Coalition may turn a blind eye. that to me sounds like the beginnings of conflict. So I wanted to do a non-human cyber knight. Now, the fatal flaw of the cyber knight is they have to abide by their code of honor. And according to even the player's guide, the cyber knight has a specific list of requirements that they have to do. They have to be upstanding. They have to be effectively Boy Scouts with paladin style powers. Now, the issue that it specifically says is that if they start breaking their tenets, they start losing their powers. And so now we've got a little bit of the draw. And if they betray enough of their tenets, eventually they become a fallen cyber knight. They gain new powers, but the book even says they become under the control of the DM. So for us, that would be a cyber knight out of control that is no longer in control by the player, me. And this could become either a character that dies very early or becomes a villain for another story or just runs amok. I don't know yet. The issue that comes up from my point of view is, well, I'm not going to build a character and just intentionally see if I can make them stab puppies, right? Like that, there's a little bit of a foregone conclusion if I'm trying to push a character to have a finality based on their character abilities and framework, unless there's a really damn good story reason for it. So, the only way to make a good story is to introduce that conflict early on. The character for Season 2 that I'm going to introduce here is he is the Marquess Shadowsteel. That is his title. He is a cyber knight. He is a half-elf, leaning more onto his human heritage. But his name is Micah Rice. And he is effectively the prince-in-waiting for a small town in just next to the Magic Zone's border, known as Ripley. Now, this town actually does exist, so if anybody from Ripley, Tennessee, is actually listening, understand that I'm not trying to forecast any conclusions or potential demon invasions of your town. It had a great location. It's right on the border of the Magic Zone, but also within striking distance of the Coalition states, but it's unclaimed territory, which means it's open space to run with my imagination. So, Micah here is going to be our next major character. And the reason I'm fascinated by him, he is a cyber knight, but he is a, level 1, right out of the gate, novice level cyber knight, which means his stats are very, very low. And I try to give him quite a few skills to kind of help his survivability. But, he's got a lot of D6s, he's got a lot of D4s. His highest attributes is strength, which is a D8, which comes up automatically because of the cyber knight abilities. His highest skill is the fighting, which is also a D8, which is a requirement for cyber knights. He has all of the normal abilities, including block, champion. He's got psionics, which will now introduce more of the player character of the magic side of Rifts. And intentionally, being a cyber knight, he is more likely to leap into the fray when it comes to magic abilities. So I'm going to lean a little bit more into the supernatural aspects of the story. However, I gave him a hindrance. I gave him 2 hindrances that compete against each other intentionally, and then 1 custom hindrance to balance them out. So his hindrances, he is hesitant, which means he gets 2 cards and has to take the lower when it comes to initiative. He has a minor obligation to lead his kingdom. He also has a minor obligation to continue his training to become cyber knight, and he has a custom minor hindrance, which is he has uncertain in his self. This hindrance that I'm creating for him is if he fails a skill roll on his next round, he has to roll a spirit check, or else he loses whatever abilities he has, or, and this is the signature item for a cyber knight, his size sword could blink out of existence. Not permanently, mind you, but he has to roll his psionic ability to get it back. The size sword is the signature item for a cyber knight. After they go through all their trials and tribulations, they effectively build their own lightsaber, right? But this, instead of it being like a physical piece of metal that summons a magic beam, it is just a sword that they summon out of their own willpower. Normally, Cyber Knights do not have to expend anything to summon their Psi Swords, which is good. They are very powerful, but it also kind of locks them into melee combat primarily. It is an incredibly powerful ability. By default, it is their, what is it? It's their Spirit die times 2, plus their Strength die, with a armor piercing of, I think it's whatever their Spirit die currently is. So for the Marquis Micah, his damage rolls from his Psi Sword is a d8 plus 2d6 with an armor piercing of 6. And as he raises his Spirit die, which will probably be what I focus on for a while, that number's just going to go up. This is a magnificently powerful ability. It puts him on the same playing ground as, juicers, if you can get into range and actually hit them, but also on power armor, on mega damage creatures, because the sword can become mega damage if he chooses it to be, and eventually he can summon a shield, or he can summon 2 swords. He can do really cool, fun, sword and sorcery level shit. But in addition, we are still leaning into the whole post-apocalyptic, somewhat cyberpunk aspect of it. So he is both a race that lives between 2 worlds, as well as a class that lives between 2 worlds. And he himself lives between leading his kingdom or training to become a Cyber Knight. I have some NPCs already pre-planned to go along with him that I feel that will augment the story quite a bit. I am really looking forward to leaning into the supernatural aspect of Savage Rifts as well, because I really enjoyed, the Yakeem portion of the stories that were fighting bandits and throwing grenades at, Samus power armors. But the times he was outclassed were the supernatural. The vampires would have beat his ass if he had stopped his car, and the Splugorth just wrecked him when he finally got a chance. And I wanted to make a character this time that can balance in between both the high mechanical, the high kind of like science fiction portion of it, as well as a little bit more of a fantasy lean into the supernatural, and be able to still hold his own for the most part. Now, what's interesting too is that Micah here is, as a novice, his stats, his abilities, his skills are way, way, way lower than Yakeem's. Having the majority of the skills being a D4 or a D6 is going to be interesting. There's a real chance that he's going to be failing a lot of rolls very, very early on. So we're going to recognize that while he may be kind of a prince and also a Cyber Knight in training, there's probably going to be some people who support him and back him up. So we will introduce those actually in the game, but I wanted to make sure that Micah himself, it's understood that he is the focus of our story. If in the course of the story he starts making decisions that break him towards breaking his vows, I will fully follow that path. I won't force it, right? But it may be on times where either the dice show that he's starting to doubt himself, his hindrances start coming into play more and more and more often, or specifically, he has to make a choice and I can't determine which way it's going to go, asking fake questions or some of the chaos rolls, that if I see the interpretations being he is intentionally now starting to go down a dark path, I will follow it. And that in itself, of not knowing if my character will eventually go corrupt and evil, that's kind of exciting to me. So I'm looking forward to this. I already have a very basic scene that I have an idea for, but we're still going to let the dice go as they may. I'll probably do more and more of this using actual physical dice and actually dealing cards, so you'll hear those more often too, instead of trying to rely on the virtual tabletop, because my real excitement and hope is that by next few, maybe within the next month or so, I'm going to have a custom gaming table. The podcasting gear will go right on it. I will not be sitting in front of a laptop. I will be sitting at a beautifully made, well, a very nicely made, actually I was involved in it. I will be sitting in front of a table. Put it there. But I'm excited for it because it's a big step for this this little nerd who had been playing at fold-out tables in basements, even up until the point that I bought my own house to have a basement and bought my own fold-out tables. So with that, we will keep this one short. Our next game will be Game 1 of Season 2, following the Marquis Shadowsteel Micah Rice. So, thank you, and good night.